The smell of jasmine always reminded me of betrayal. It was blooming outside my kitchen window that Tuesday morning in May when I discovered that my daughter-in-law was sleeping with my husband. Not through some dramatic confrontation or tearful confession, but through the mundane cruelty of a forgotten phone notification. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. David's iPhone lay face up on our granite countertop, buzzing insistently as he showered upstairs. The message preview glowed against the black screen. Last night was incredible. Can't wait until Mom goes to her book club Thursday. The sender's name made my coffee cup slip from my fingers. Chloe. My son Michael's wife of 3 years. The woman I'd helped plan a baby shower for just 6 months ago. The mother of my 18-month-old granddaughter, Emma. A glass shattered against the Italian tile, sending coffee splashing across my bare feet, but I barely felt the sting. My eyes remained fixed on that screen, reading and rereading those 14 words that had just incinerated 26 years of marriage. Last night was incredible. I knew David had worked late at the firm again, coming home after midnight with the excuse of a difficult merger case. I'd left dinner wrapped in foil, kissed his forehead when he finally slipped into bed at 2 a.m., whispering that he needed to take better care of himself. Can't wait until Mom goes to her book club Thursday. Mom. She called me Mom, just like Michael had been calling me that since their engagement, her sweet southern accent making it sound like a term of endearment rather than the designation it truly was. Every Thursday for the past 4 years, I'd driven across town to discuss literature with 12 other women, returning home by 10 with stories about our latest selection and leftover wine on my breath. How long had they been counting down those Thursday evenings? How many times had I kissed David goodbye, telling him not to wait up, while he mentally calculated the hours until I'd be gone? The shower was still running upstairs. I could hear David's off-key humming, probably that old Eagles song he always sang when he was in a particularly good mood. Of course he was happy. He was 53 years old, managing partner at Charleston's most prestigious law firm, and apparently sleeping with a 28-year-old woman who happened to be his son's wife. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My hands shook as I photographed the message with my own phone before deleting the evidence from David's screen. The motion was instinctive, self-preserving. Whatever I decided to do with this information, I needed proof that couldn't be denied or explained away. As I swept up the broken coffee cup, my mind began cataloging all the small signs I'd missed or chosen to ignore. Chloe's sudden interest in David's work stories at family dinners. The way she'd started dressing more carefully when she knew he'd be around. David's newfound enthusiasm for Michael and Chloe's weekly visits, his insistence that we needed to be more involved grandparents, more involved. Christ, the irony was that I'd encouraged their relationship from the beginning. When Michael brought Chloe home during his senior year at Clemson, I'd been charmed by her intelligence and warmth. She was studying early childhood education, passionate about helping underprivileged kids, genuinely sweet in a way that seemed rare among his previous girlfriends. I'd welcomed her into our family dinners, helped her find a teaching job when they moved back to Charleston, celebrated when Michael proposed with his grandmother's ring. When Emma was born, I'd been in the delivery room, holding Chloe's hand through contractions while Michael paced the hallway in terror. Now I wondered if David had been attracted to her even then. If he'd been planning the seduction while I'd been playing the role of loving mother-in-law, completely oblivious to the predator circling my family. The shower stopped. David's footsteps moved across our bedroom floor overhead, probably selecting another expensive suit to wear while betraying everything we'd built together. In 15 minutes, he'd come downstairs expecting breakfast and small talk about our days, playing the role of devoted husband while mentally planning his next encounter with our son's wife. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the photograph on my phone. Such a small thing to destroy an entire world. 14 words that revealed 26 years of marriage as an illusion, a performance I'd been giving without realizing I was the only one who didn't know it was a show. My reflection caught in the sliding glass door leading to our back garden. 51 years old, auburn hair that I'd been touching up with increasingly expensive treatments, laugh lines that had once made David smile, now probably just evidence of my aging. When had he stopped seeing me and started seeing her? Chloe was beautiful in that effortless way that comes with youth. Honey blonde hair, bright green eyes, the kind of figure that snapped back immediately after pregnancy. She had energy and possibility written in every gesture, while I had routine and history weighing down my shoulders like a coat I couldn't remove. The rational part of my mind knew I should confront them. Scream, throw things, demand explanations. And apologies. File for divorce, tell Michael, destroy their secret with the nuclear weapon of truth. But as I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by the detritus of my shattered illusions, another idea began forming. Something colder and more calculated than righteous anger. What if I didn't say anything? What if I let them continue their affair, thinking they were cleverly deceiving the naive older woman who trusted them both? What if I used their arrogance against them? David's footsteps were on the stairs now. In 30 seconds, he'd walk into this kitchen, kiss my cheek, and ask about my plans for the day while the taste of my daughter-in-law was probably still lingering in his mouth. I deleted the photograph from my recent images and cleared my browsing history. Then I began planning. Morning, beautiful, David said, entering the kitchen in his charcoal Armani suit. He looked exactly like the successful lawyer he was, silver hair perfectly styled, confident smile, expensive watch catching the morning light. This was the man I'd fallen in love with in law school, the father of my children, the person I'd trusted with every secret and vulnerability. Now he was a stranger wearing my husband's face. Good morning, I replied, forcing warmth into my voice as he kissed my cheek. His cologne was different. Subtler, more sophisticated. Probably something Chloe had picked out. Coffee's fresh. You're an angel, he said, filling his travel mug. I might be late again tonight. The Morrison case is hitting some complications. The Morrison case had closed 6 weeks ago. I knew because I'd helped him celebrate the victory with champagne and his favorite dinner. But I nodded sympathetically, playing my assigned role in his deception. I understand. I'm having lunch with Janet anyway, then book club tonight. Will you remember to eat something? Of course. He squeezed my shoulder absently, already mentally somewhere else. With someone else. Michael called yesterday about bringing Emma over this weekend. I told him we'd love to have them. Them? Plural. David was inviting his mistress and their shared granddaughter for a family weekend while I played the unknowing grandmother. The audacity was breathtaking. That sounds wonderful, I said. I'll make Emma's favorite cookies. After David left for work, I sat alone in our kitchen, planning the performance of my life. If he wanted to play games, I'd show him what a real strategist could accomplish. If Chloe thought she could manipulate her way into my family and steal my husband, she was about to learn that experience trumped youth every time. I had advantages they didn't know about. 26 years of knowing David's habits, weaknesses, and secrets. A law degree of my own that I'd set aside to raise children. But never forgotten. Financial accounts they assumed I didn't monitor. Social connections they couldn't imagine. Most importantly, I had something they'd never possessed. Nothing left to lose. By the time they realized I'd known all along, it would be too late. The foundation of their secret affair was about to become their downfall, and I would be the architect of their destruction. The jasmine outside my window released another wave of perfume into the morning air. Soon, it would always remind me of the day I stopped being a victim and started being something far more dangerous. A woman with a plan. The Charleston Family Law Library hadn't changed much in 15 years. Same mahogany shelves, same leather-bound volumes, same hushed atmosphere that had once made me feel like I belonged in the legal world. Now it felt like returning to a weapon I'd forgotten how to wield. Catherine Morrison, the young librarian, read from my old bar card, squinting at the faded photograph. Your membership expired in 2008, but I can issue you a day pass for research purposes. Thank you, I said, accepting the temporary badge. I'm updating some estate planning documents. Nothing too complicated. It was only partially a lie. I was planning for the end of an estate, my marriage, but the research I needed went far beyond simple divorce proceedings. 3 hours later, I'd filled a legal pad with notes about South Carolina's adultery laws, property division statutes, and custody considerations for grandparents. The picture was clearer than I'd hoped and more complicated than I'd feared. South Carolina was one of the few states where adultery could still impact divorce proceedings, potentially affecting alimony and property division. But proving adultery required more than a single text message. I needed documentation, witnesses. A pattern of behavior that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. More troubling was the custody issue. If Michael and Chloe's marriage imploded, and my revelations would certainly trigger that explosion, Emma could become a casualty. South Carolina courts prioritized the child's best interests, but grandparents' rights were limited. I could lose access to my granddaughter along with everything else. My phone buzzed as I packed my notes. A text from Michael: "Mom, can we talk? Something's bothering me about Chloe lately." The timing was either cosmic irony or my son's intuition finally catching up with reality. I typed back, "Of course, sweetheart. Dinner tonight? Dad's working late." The response came immediately: "Perfect. 7 p.m.? I can bring Emma." I drove home through Charleston's historic district, past the antebellum mansions and moss-draped oaks that had witnessed centuries of Southern family dramas. How many wives had sat in those grand parlors, discovering their husbands' infidelities? How many had chosen silence over scandal, preservation over justice? But I wasn't living in 1850. I had options my predecessors couldn't have imagined, and I intended to use every one of them. At home, I began preparing Michael's favorite meal, shrimp and grits with andouille sausage, the recipe his grandmother had taught me during my first year of marriage. Cooking had always been my meditation, a way to channel nervous energy into something productive. Tonight, it felt like armor. The doorbell rang at exactly 7 o'clock. Michael had always been punctual, a trait he'd inherited from David along with his height and stubborn streak. Emma toddled in ahead of him, all blonde curls and infectious giggles, immediately making a beeline for the toy box I kept in the living room. "Smells incredible in here," Michael said, kissing my cheek. At 29, he was the perfect blend of his parents, David's sharp intelligence softened by what I hoped was my compassion. "Where's Dad?" "Working late again," I said, watching his expression carefully. "The Morrison case is apparently more complicated than expected." "The Morrison case closed 6 weeks ago," Michael said without thinking, then caught himself. "I mean, I thought it did. Maybe there are appeals or something." So he knew about his father's lies too, or at least suspected them. The question was how much he'd figured out and whether he had any idea who David was lying to see. "You mentioned something was bothering you about Chloe," I said as we settled at the dining room table. Emma was content with her toys, babbling happily to herself in the living room. Michael's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "It's probably nothing. Marriage stuff, you know? But she's been distant lately. Distracted. Always on her phone, staying out later when she goes to her book club." My blood chilled. "Book club?" "Yeah, she joined one a couple months ago. Meets Thursday nights, same as yours." I thought it was great, you know how much she loves reading. But when I asked her about the books they're discussing, she gets vague. Changes the subject. "Thursday nights." The same Thursday nights when I left for my own book club, giving David and Chloe their weekly window of opportunity. She'd probably told Michael she was discussing literature while she was upstairs in my bed with my husband. "Sometimes people need space to process things," I said carefully. "Early marriage can be an adjustment, especially with a baby." "That's what I keep telling myself." "But Mom..." Michael set down his fork and looked directly at me. "I found a hotel receipt in her purse last week. The Bellman Charleston place. We've never stayed there together, and it was for last Thursday night." The Bellman Charleston place. The most expensive hotel in the city, the kind of place David would choose to impress a young woman. A place where they wouldn't risk running into anyone from our social circle. "Did you ask her about it?" "She said it was for her sister's bachelorette party in Savannah. But her sister got married 2 years ago." Michael's voice cracked slightly. "Mom, I think Chloe might be having an affair." The words hung in the air between us like a loaded gun. My son suspected his wife of cheating, but he had no idea the betrayal went so much deeper. No idea that his father was the other man, that his trust was being violated by the two people who should have protected him most. "Oh, sweetheart," I said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "Have you tried talking to her directly? Every time I bring it up, she gets defensive. Says I'm being paranoid, that new motherhood has been stressful, that I should trust her more." He laughed bitterly. "Maybe I am being paranoid. Maybe I'm seeing problems that aren't there." "Your instincts are usually good," I said. "If something feels wrong, it probably is." It was the truth, even if I couldn't tell him how right. His instincts were Emma chose that moment to toddle into the dining room, her arms outstretched toward Michael. Daddy. Up. The transformation in Michael's face was immediate and complete. Whatever pain and confusion he was feeling disappeared behind pure adoration as he lifted his daughter into his lap. Emma giggled and grabbed at his napkin, her tiny fingers sticky with whatever she'd found in the toy box. Hey there, beautiful girl, he murmured, kissing the top of her head. Are you being good for Grandma? Watching them together, I felt the full weight of what David and Chloe's affair could destroy. Not just my marriage or even Michael's, but this innocent child's sense of security. Emma adored both her grandfathers equally, and David was genuinely wonderful with her. If this secret came out, when it came out, she would lose that relationship along with everything else. Michael, I said slowly, what would you do if you discovered Chloe was definitely having an affair? Hypothetically. He was quiet for a long moment, absently stroking Emma's hair. Honestly? I don't know. Part of me would want to fight for our marriage, especially for Emma's sake. But if she's chosen someone else? He shrugged helplessly. I can't compete with someone I don't even know exists. But you do know him, I thought. You've known him your entire life. And what if the someone was someone you knew? Someone close to the family? Michael's expression darkened. Then I'd probably kill him. The casual way he said it sent ice through my veins. Michael had inherited David's temper along with his other traits, and while he'd never been violent, I'd seen him rage when he felt betrayed. In high school, he'd broken his best friend's nose after discovering the boy had been spreading rumors about me. In college, he'd been suspended for fighting when his roommate had stolen his girlfriend. If Michael discovered his father was sleeping with his wife, the confrontation would be nuclear. And in South Carolina, a crime of passion carried different penalties than premeditated murder. That's a very dangerous way to think, I said carefully. Maybe. But some betrayals deserve consequences. Emma had fallen asleep in his arms, her head tucked against his shoulder. Michael looked down at her with such tenderness that my heart broke a little more. This man deserved so much better than what was being done to him. I should get her home, he said softly. Chloe's book club ends at 9, and I want to be there when she gets back. Maybe I'll finally work up the courage to have that conversation. After they left, I sat in my empty house, surrounded by the artifacts of my disintegrating life. Wedding photos on the mantel showing David and me young and hopeful. Family portraits chronicling Michael's growth from baby to man. Recent pictures of Emma's first birthday, everyone smiling and unaware that the foundation was already cracking beneath their feet. My phone rang at exactly 9:30. David's name appeared on the screen. Hey, sweetheart, his voice was carefully casual. Just leaving the office. How was your evening? Lovely. Michael came for dinner. We had a nice talk. I paused, letting the silence stretch. He's worried. About Chloe. Thinks she might be having an affair. The silence on David's end lasted 3 heartbeats too long. That's terrible. Poor Michael. What makes him think that? Oh, the usual signs. Staying out late, being secretive about where she's been. You know how it is, when someone's being unfaithful, they tend to get sloppy with their lies. Right. Well, I'm sure it's nothing. Young couples go through rough patches. I'm sure you're right, I said sweetly. After all, you'd know better than anyone how to spot the signs of infidelity. Another pause. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing at all. Just that you've been a lawyer for 30 years. You must have handled dozens of divorce cases involving adultery. Of course. Yes, that's what I meant. David was rattled. And that gave me a small surge of satisfaction. Let him wonder if I suspected something. Let him lose sleep trying to figure out how much I knew. I'll see you when you get home, I said. Don't be too late. I have some things I want to discuss with you. What kind of things? Estate planning. Retirement accounts. That sort of thing. I let my voice turn thoughtful. It's important to make sure all our assets are protected, don't you think? Especially if there are any major changes coming in our lives. The line went quiet for so long I thought he'd hung up. Catherine, he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. Is there something specific you want to talk about? Just the future, David. Our future. How we want to spend the rest of our lives, and with whom. I hung up before he could respond, then turned off my phone entirely. Let him sit with that conversation during his drive home. Let him wonder if his carefully constructed double life was about to collapse. While I waited, I opened my laptop and began researching private investigators in Charleston. If I was going to build a case against David and Chloe, I needed more than text messages and suspicious hotel receipts. I needed photographs, documentation, a pattern of behavior so clear that no jury would question the evidence, but more than that, I needed to understand the full scope of their betrayal. How long had this been going on? How many Thursday nights had they stolen from me? How many family dinners had they sat through, sharing secret glances while I played the oblivious wife and mother? The front door opened at 10:15. David's footsteps moved through the house with unusual caution, as if he was afraid of what he might find. When he appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face was pale and uncertain. "Catherine? You said you wanted to discuss something?" I looked up from my laptop, studying his face in the soft kitchen light. This man had been my everything for 26 years. My lover, my partner, my best friend. The father of my children, my safe harbor in every storm. Now he was a stranger who happened to share my last name. "Actually," I said, closing the laptop with a soft click, "I think I'll wait. Some conversations are better saved for the right moment." What's that supposed to mean? I stood and walked past him toward the stairs, pausing to place my hand on his chest. His heart was racing beneath my palm. "It means, darling husband, that timing is everything. And I'm a very patient woman." I left him standing in the kitchen, confusion and fear written across his features. Tomorrow, I would contact the private investigator. Tomorrow, I would begin building the case that would destroy them both. Tonight, I would lie awake in our bed, planning every move in a game they didn't even know we were playing. The war had begun, and they'd already lost. They just didn't know it yet. Raymond Fletcher looked like every private investigator in every noir movie: weathered face, sharp eyes, and an office that smelled of coffee and cigarettes despite the no-smoking signs plastered on every surface. His secretary had scheduled me for 10 a.m. on a Wednesday, the kind of appointment that felt both mundane and life-altering. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, gesturing to the cracked leather chair across from his desk. "Your call mentioned infidelity. Surveillance. Standard rate is $500 a day plus expenses." "Money isn't an issue," I replied, settling my purse in my lap. "Discretion is." Fletcher's eyebrows rose slightly. "Lady, discretion is what you're paying for. Tell me about the situation." For the next hour, I laid out the basics: suspected affair, need for documentation, desire to protect my financial interests in an eventual divorce. What I didn't tell him was that my husband was one of Charleston's most prominent attorneys, or that the other woman was my daughter-in-law. Some complications were better revealed gradually. Thursday nights seemed to be their regular pattern. I concluded. Hotel meetings, always the same place. Should be straightforward surveillance. "Should be," Fletcher agreed, making notes in a file that already bore my assumed name, Catherine Davis. But 25 years in this business taught me that family cases are never straightforward. There's always something nobody mentions in the first meeting. He was more perceptive than I'd expected. Such as why you're hiring me instead of filing for divorce immediately. Such as why you care about building a case instead of just walking away. Such as why you look like a woman planning a war instead of ending a marriage. The observation was unsettling in its accuracy. Perhaps I believe in being thorough. Perhaps. Or perhaps there's more to this story than a simple affair. Fletcher leaned back in his chair, studying my face. "Mrs. Davis, I've been doing this long enough to recognize when someone wants more than evidence. They want weapons." The man was good. Too good. But that also meant he might be exactly what I needed. Let's say, hypothetically, that I wanted more than just proof of adultery. Let's say I wanted to understand the full scope of their relationship. Financial entanglements, communication patterns, whether there are other parties involved. Would that change your approach? "It would change my price," Fletcher said bluntly. "Deep surveillance, financial investigations, digital forensics, that's specialized work. We're talking $1,500 a day, minimum 2-week commitment." "Done." "And Mrs. Davis?" Fletcher's voice carried a warning. "Whatever you're planning to do with this information, make sure it's legal. I don't provide evidence for clients who plan to use it criminally." I met his gaze steadily. Mr. Fletcher, I'm not planning to break any laws. I'm planning to use them. After signing the contracts and providing Fletcher with David's schedule and photographs, I drove to the Charleston tea plantation for lunch with Janet Williamson, my oldest friend and the only person who might understand what I was going through. Janet had divorced her first husband 15 years ago after discovering his affair with their neighbor. She'd remarried happily, but the experience had left her with sharp insights about infidelity and its aftermath. "You look terrible," she said bluntly as we settled at a table overlooking the tea fields. "And before you tell me you're fine, remember that I've known you since law school." "What's wrong?" I'd rehearsed this conversation during the drive, but sitting across from Janet's concerned face, the words stuck in my throat. Saying it aloud would make it real in a way that even hiring Fletcher hadn't. "David's having an affair," I said finally. Janet's fork clattered against her plate. "What? Catherine, are you sure?" "I'm sure." "With whom?" This was the part one couldn't say. Not yet. Not until I understood more about how deep this betrayal went. Someone younger. Someone I trusted. "Oh, honey." Janet reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "I'm so sorry. How did you find out?" I told her about the text message, the hotel receipts Michael had found, the Thursday night patterns. What I didn't tell her was the identity of David's mistress or my plans for revenge. "Have you confronted him?" "No." "Why not?" "Because I want to understand what I'm dealing with first. How long it's been going on, whether it's serious or just a fling, what it means for our finances and our family." Janet nodded slowly. "Smart. Emotional confrontations rarely end well. But Catherine, you can't live in limbo forever. This secret will eat you alive." "I know. But knowledge is power, and right now, I don't have enough of either." "What does Michael think about all this?" My stomach clenched. "Michael doesn't know." "You haven't told him about his father's affair?" "It's complicated. More complicated than Janet could possibly imagine. I want to protect him from the fallout as long as possible." "Protect him, or protect yourself from his reaction?" Janet had always been too perceptive for comfort. "Maybe both." We spent the rest of lunch discussing practical matters, divorce attorneys, financial planning, custody arrangements. Janet had been through this war and could guide me through the tactical considerations I was still learning. "Whatever you do," she said as we prepared to leave, "don't let anger drive your decisions. I know it's tempting to want revenge, but the goal should be protecting your future, not punishing their past." Too late for that, I thought. But I nodded and promised to consider her advice. Thursday arrived with unseasonable heat and humidity that made the air feel thick as soup. I'd told David I was going to book club as usual, maintaining the routine that had become the framework for their affair. Instead, I parked 3 blocks from the Bellman Charleston place and waited. Fletcher had provided me with a burner phone that would receive real-time updates from his surveillance team. At 6:30, the first message arrived, subject 1 entering. Hotel lobby. Reservation under name Morrison. David was using his real name. Either he was getting careless, or he wanted to be caught. Neither option spoke well for his intelligence or his respect for me. At 7:15, subject 2 arriving. Blonde female, late 20s, designer dress. Subjects embracing in lobby. They weren't even trying to be discreet. David was treating this like a legitimate relationship, not a secret affair. That suggested either supreme arrogance or genuine emotion on his part. At 8:30, subjects proceeding to room 412. "Do you want interior surveillance?" I typed back, "No. Just document arrival and departure times." I didn't need to see what they did in that room. My imagination was providing more than enough detail, and some images couldn't be unseen. Instead, I drove to Michael and Chloe's house in Mount Pleasant. Their subdivision was the kind of place young families aspired to: neat lawns, playground equipment in backyards, minivans and SUVs in every driveway. I parked across the street and watched the warm light spilling from their windows. Michael was visible through the kitchen window, washing dishes with Emma perched on his hip. They were laughing about something, probably the bath time routine. That always left Emma soaked and giggling. It was such a perfect picture of domestic happiness that my heart ached for what was about to be destroyed. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Mom, Chloe's at book club again. Want to come over? For coffee? Emma's being especially cute tonight." The invitation was tempting and heartbreaking in equal measure. I wanted to hold my granddaughter, to pretend for a few hours that our family wasn't disintegrating. But sitting in that house, surrounded by the life Chloe was betraying, would be more than I could bear. I typed back, rain check, sweetheart. Tired tonight. Give Emma a kiss from Grandma. At 9:45, Fletcher's final message arrived, subjects departing separately. Subject 2 leaving first, Subject 1 following 10 minutes later. The logistics were careful and practiced. They'd developed a routine over weeks or months, maybe longer. This wasn't a new affair driven by sudden passion, it was an established relationship with its own patterns and protocols. I drove home slowly, taking the long route through downtown Charleston. The historic district was beautiful at night, gas lamps flickering along cobblestone streets, antebellum mansions glowing with warm light. 26 years ago, David and I had walked these streets as newlyweds, dreaming about the life we'd build together. How naive I'd been to think that love was enough to sustain a marriage. How foolish to believe that loyalty was reciprocal, that trust once given would be honored. David's Mercedes was already in the driveway when I arrived home. He was sitting in the living room, still dressed in his suit, a glass of bourbon in his hand and an expression of barely controlled panic on his face. "How was book club?" he asked as I hung up my purse. "Enlightening," I replied. "We discussed betrayal in literature. How characters respond when they discover they've been deceived by people they trusted." David's grip tightened on his glass. "Sounds heavy." It was. There's something fascinating about the psychology of deception. How betrayers justify their actions, how they compartmentalize their lies, how they convince themselves that their victims deserve what's happening to them. "Catherine, what are you really talking about?" I turned to face him fully, taking in every detail of his appearance. His tie was slightly askew, his hair less perfectly styled than usual. There was lipstick on his collar, a faint smudge of the rose shade Chloe favored. "I'm talking about consequence, David. How every action creates ripples that spread farther than the actor ever imagined. How betrayal doesn't exist in isolation, it affects families, children, entire communities." "You're scaring me." "Good. You should be scared." I left him sitting there and went upstairs to our bedroom. The bed we'd shared for 26 years suddenly felt contaminated, tainted by knowledge of where he'd been and what he'd done. The sheets would need to be changed, the mattress replaced, the entire room cleansed of his betrayal. My laptop was waiting on the nightstand, and I opened it to find an encrypted email from Fletcher containing the first batch of surveillance photos. David entering the hotel, confident and relaxed. Chloe arriving 20 minutes later, beautiful in a way that made my middle-aged insecurities flare painfully. The two of them embracing in the lobby like lovers meeting for a romantic evening, but it was the final photo that stopped my breath entirely. David and Chloe standing together outside the hotel, and in the background, partially visible through a restaurant window, was another familiar face, Richard Sterling, David's law partner and my son's godfather. The man who'd been best man at our wedding, who'd held Michael as a baby, who'd been like a brother to David for 30 years. Richard wasn't just coincidentally dining in the same area. He was watching David and Chloe, his expression calculating and alert. This wasn't a chance encounter, it was surveillance. I scrolled through Fletcher's preliminary report, my hands shaking as the implications became clear. Richard had been at or near the hotel on 3 separate occasions when David and Chloe met. His credit card had been used at restaurants within a 2-block radius of their meetings 6 times in the past month. David's law partner was watching his affair. The question was why. Was Richard gathering evidence to use against David? Was he involved in some kind of blackmail scheme? Or was there something even more sinister at play, a conspiracy that went beyond simple adultery? My phone rang, jolting me from my spiraling thoughts. The caller ID showed Fletcher's number. "Mrs. Davis, I need to meet with you tomorrow. There are some things about this case that we need to discuss in person." "What kind of things?" "The kind that suggest your husband's affair is the least of your problems." The line went dead, leaving me staring at surveillance photos that had transformed from evidence of betrayal into something far more complex and dangerous. David's affair with Chloe was just the surface of whatever was happening. Beneath it lay currents I was only beginning to understand, and I had the terrible feeling that I'd stumbled into something much larger than a simple case of infidelity. In the distance, I could hear David moving around downstairs, probably pacing and drinking. As he tried to figure out how much I knew. But the truth was, I was beginning to realize that I knew almost nothing at all. The war I thought I was fighting was about to become something entirely different, and I wasn't sure I was prepared for the battle that was coming. Fletcher's office felt different on Friday morning, charged with an electricity that hadn't been there before. He'd moved several files to a locked cabinet, and there was a new tension in his shoulders as he gestured me to the chair across from his desk. "Mrs. Davis," he began, then stopped himself. "Actually, let's dispense with the fake names. Mrs. Catherine Morrison, wife of David Morrison, managing partner at Sterling and Morrison." My blood went cold. "How did you?" "Because I've been investigating your husband for 3 months already. For someone else." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. "What?" Fletcher opened a thick file and spread photographs across his desk. Images of David entering and leaving the hotel, meeting with various people I didn't recognize, exchanging envelopes in parking garages like something out of a spy thriller. "Your husband is being investigated by the South Carolina Bar Association for client fund misappropriation. Richard Sterling filed the initial complaint 6 weeks ago." Richard, David's best friend, his law partner of 15 years, the man who'd stood beside him at our wedding. Richard reported David? Sterling discovered irregularities in the firm's escrow accounts. Money missing from client settlements, funds diverted to personal accounts, forged documents authorizing transfers. We're talking about $2.8 million over the past 18 months. I stared at the photographs, trying to process what Fletcher was telling me. David wasn't just cheating on me, he was stealing from clients, destroying the law practice he'd spent decades building. "The affair with your daughter-in-law," Fletcher continued, "appears to be a secondary issue. Sterling hired me to document David's movements, thinking the financial crimes might be connected to gambling or drug debts. Instead, I found him spending stolen money on a much younger woman." "Chloe doesn't know about the money," I said automatically, then stopped. "Did she? How could I be sure of anything anymore?" "That's where things get interesting." Fletcher pulled out another set of photos. "Your daughter-in-law has been making unusual financial transactions of her own. Cash deposits to accounts that don't match her teaching salary. Purchases well beyond her means. A new car, expensive jewelry, designer clothes." The evidence was damning. Chloe in a jewelry store, examining a diamond bracelet that cost more than she made in 6 months. Chloe at a BMW dealership, signing papers for a car that was supposedly a surprise gift from a wealthy aunt. "She's being paid," I whispered. "It appears so. The question is whether she knows where the money is coming from, or if your husband told her some other story to explain his sudden generosity." I thought about Chloe's behavior over the past months, the new confidence, the expensive clothes she'd explained away as teaching bonuses or lucky finds at consignment shops. She'd been living above her means, and I'd been too distracted by my own marital problems to question it. "There's more," Fletcher said grimly. "The Bar Association investigation has expanded to include other law firms. They think Sterling and Morrison might be part of a larger money laundering operation involving real estate transactions and settlement funds." Money laundering? The words felt foreign in my mouth. This was the kind of crime I read about in newspapers, not something that happened to people like us. "Your husband has been meeting regularly with Marcus Pellegrino, a developer with known connections to organized crime families in Charleston and Savannah. Pellegrino's projects have been funded through several law firms, all handling real estate closings that funnel dirty money through legitimate transactions." Fletcher showed me surveillance photos of David meeting with a heavy-set man in expensive suits. They were shaking hands outside a construction site, exchanging briefcases like characters in a crime movie. "The FBI is now involved," Fletcher continued. "Federal agents have been watching Pellegrino for 2 years, and your husband's name keeps appearing in their surveillance reports." Federal agents. FBI investigation. Money laundering. The scope of David's crimes was expanding beyond anything I could have imagined when I hired Fletcher to document a simple affair. "What does this mean for me?" I asked. "For my family? It means you need a criminal defense attorney, not a divorce lawyer. If David is arrested, and he will be, they'll freeze all marital assets pending investigation. Your house, your retirement accounts, everything could be considered proceeds of criminal activity. The implications crashed over me like a tsunami. Not only was I losing my husband to another woman, I was potentially losing everything we'd built together. Our home, our financial security, our reputation in Charleston's tight-knit legal community. And Michael? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. That depends on how involved Chloe is. If she's just a naive mistress being spoiled with stolen money, she might face charges for receiving stolen property. If she's an active participant in the money laundering scheme, Fletcher shrugged. Then your son is married to a criminal. I stared at the photographs spread across Fletcher's desk, trying to reconcile these images with the people I thought I knew. David, the respected attorney who'd built his reputation on integrity and client advocacy. Chloe, the sweet teacher, who'd captured my son's heart with her compassion for children. Both of them were strangers wearing familiar faces. Why didn't Richard come to me with this information? I asked. Because he's trying to save the law firm. If David's crimes become public, Sterling and Morrison collapses. 30 years of building their practice, gone. Richard's hoping to contain the damage by cooperating with investigators and possibly forcing David out quietly. But that won't work now that the FBI is involved. No. Once federal agents are tracking money laundering, there's no quiet resolution. This is going to explode publicly, probably within the next few weeks. I felt like I was drowning in information I wasn't equipped to handle. Yesterday, my biggest problem was discovering my husband's affair. Today, I was learning that he was a federal criminal whose actions could destroy multiple families. What do you recommend I do? Get a lawyer immediately. Someone with experience in federal criminal defense who can protect your interests when the arrests start. Distance yourself from David's finances as much as possible. And prepare your son for what's coming. How do I tell Michael that his father is a criminal and his wife might be an accomplice? Carefully. And soon. Because when this breaks in the media, you want your family to hear it from you first. I left Fletcher's office with copies of his files and a list of recommended attorneys. The drive home was a blur of Charleston streets. That suddenly felt foreign and threatening. How long did I have before federal agents knocked on my door? How much time to prepare for the destruction of everything I'd called home? David's Mercedes wasn't in the driveway when I arrived, but Richard. Sterling's BMW was parked across the street. He was sitting behind the wheel, talking on his phone, and when he saw me, he ended the call and got out of the car. "Catherine," he said, his face grim. "We need to talk." Richard had been part of our lives for so long that seeing him felt almost comforting despite everything Fletcher had told me. He'd been at every birthday party, every holiday dinner, every major milestone in our family's history. If anyone could help me navigate this disaster, it should be him. "I suppose you know why I'm here," he said as we settled in my living room. Fletcher told me about the Bar Association investigation. About the missing client funds. Richard's shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank God you know. I've been trying to figure out how to approach you for weeks. You could have started with the truth." "The truth is complicated, Catherine. David's been stealing from clients for over a year, but I only discovered it recently. When I confronted him, he broke down completely. Admitted everything. Including the affair with Chloe?" Richard's face darkened. "That's a separate issue, but yes. He told me about that too. Said it started as comfort after you two began having marital problems, then escalated when she started asking for money." The implication hit me like a slap. "You're saying Chloe demanded payment for the affair?" "I'm saying she went from being a victim of David's midlife crisis to being an active participant in his financial crimes. The cash deposits, the expensive purchases, that's not David spoiling his mistress. That's Chloe blackmailing her lover." The revelation recontextualized everything I thought I understood about their relationship. Chloe wasn't just the other woman, she was exploiting David's guilt and fear to fund her lifestyle. She'd turned their affair into a business transaction. "Does Michael know about the affair?" "He suspects." "About the blackmail?" "No. And Catherine, if this comes out during the federal investigation, it won't just destroy David. It'll destroy your son's marriage and probably his relationship with Emma." Emma. I'd been so focused on the adult drama that I'd barely considered my granddaughter's perspective. When this scandal broke, she would lose her grandfather to federal prison and possibly her mother to criminal charges. "There might be a way to minimize the damage," Richard said carefully. If David cooperates with the FBI, provides information about Pellegrino's operation, he could receive a reduced sentence. 5 years instead of 20. And in exchange? He testifies against everyone else involved in the money laundering scheme, including Chloe, if necessary. The chess game was becoming clearer. Richard wasn't just trying to save the law firm, he was positioning David to trade his wife and mistress for a lighter sentence. Everyone David claimed to love would be sacrificed to protect his own interests. What about the firm? I'm hoping to restructure as a solo practice, pay back the stolen funds, and rebuild our reputation. It'll take years, but it's possible if I distance myself from David's crimes completely. By throwing him to the federal prosecutors. By letting him face the consequences of his own choices. Richard's voice hardened. I didn't steal that money, Catherine. I didn't seduce my partner's daughter-in-law. I didn't get involved with organized crime. David made those decisions, and now he needs to pay for them. The front door opened, and David walked in carrying Chinese takeout and wearing the expression of a man trying too hard to appear normal. When he saw Richard sitting in our living room, his face went pale. Rick, he said carefully. I wasn't expecting to see you here. We need to finish our conversation from yesterday, Richard replied, standing up. All three of us. David set down the food and looked between Richard and me, calculating how much I knew and how much trouble he was in. His hands were shaking slightly, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. How much has she told you? David asked Richard. How much has who told me what? I interrupted. Richard, is there something else I should know? The two men exchanged a look that confirmed my worst fears. There was another layer to this story, another revelation that would shatter what remained of my understanding. David, Richard said quietly, tell her about the trust fund. David closed his eyes and took a deep breath. When he opened them, the last trace of the man I'd married was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. Catherine, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, the money I stole wasn't just from random clients. Some of it was from Emma's college fund. The trust fund your parents established for their grandchildren. The words hit me like a physical blow. My parents had died in a car accident when Michael was 15, leaving behind a substantial inheritance that David and I had promised to preserve for our future grandchildren. Emma's education, her future, her security, all of it stolen by the grandfather she adored. How much? I whispered. All of it. $200,000. I sank into my chair, overwhelmed by the scope of his betrayal. He hadn't just stolen from clients and cheated on his wife. He'd robbed his own granddaughter's future to fund his affair and criminal activities. Richard cleared his throat uncomfortably. There's one more thing. The FBI thinks Chloe knew about the trust fund theft. She specifically requested money for Emma's future, not knowing that David was stealing from Emma's actual future to pay her. The irony was so cruel it was almost artistic. Chloe was being paid with money intended for her own daughter, blood. Money that would leave Emma financially vulnerable while funding her mother's betrayal of the family. When do the arrests happen? I asked. Monday morning, Richard replied. Federal agents will serve warrants simultaneously on David, Pellegrino, and at least 6 other people involved in the money laundering operation. Including Chloe? Probably. Monday morning. For days to prepare for the complete destruction of my family. For days to figure out how to protect Emma and Michael from the fallout of their father and wife's crimes. 4 days to decide whether I wanted to save David Morrison or destroy him completely. Looking at his face, guilt and fear mixed with a pathetic hope that I might somehow forgive all of this, I realized that my husband had been dead to me long before I discovered his affair. The question now was whether I would mourn him or bury him myself. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of oppressive heat that made Charleston feel like a pressure cooker about to explode. I stood in my kitchen, staring at the Chinese takeout containers David had abandoned the night before, trying to process the fact that I had less than 48 hours before my world imploded completely. The house felt like a museum of a life that no longer existed. Wedding photos mocked me from their silver frames, family portraits chronicled a happiness that had been built on lies, and every surface held memories of a marriage that had died. Long before I discovered the body.my phone buzzed with a text from Michael. Dad called this morning wanting to take Emma to the park. Said he had something important to discuss with me. Should I be worried? Yes, I typed back, then deleted it. He's probably just missing you both. Enjoy the sunshine. David was going to tell Michael everything. Or at least his version of everything, the sanitized story that painted him as a victim of circumstances rather than the architect of his own destruction. He would blame the stress of partnership, the pressure of maintaining our lifestyle, maybe even hint that my emotional distance had driven him to seek comfort elsewhere. What he wouldn't tell Michael was that he'd stolen Emma's college fund to pay his blackmailing mistress. That detail would remain buried until federal agents dragged it into the light Monday morning. I called the criminal defense attorney Fletcher had recommended, Margaret Chen, no relation to any of the women from my inspiration story, but a sharp-eyed former federal prosecutor who specialized in white-collar crime. Her weekend answering service patched me through immediately. Mrs. Morrison, she said without preamble, Raymond Fletcher briefed me on your situation. How much time do we have? Arrests are scheduled for Monday morning. Then we need to meet. Today. My office, 2 o'clock. Bring every financial document you can find, bank statements, investment accounts, real estate records, anything with both your names on it. After ending the call, I spent the morning gathering paperwork and trying to mentally prepare for a conversation I'd never imagined having. How did someone discuss federal money laundering charges over coffee on a Saturday afternoon? The law offices of Chen and Associates occupied the top floor of a renovated antebellum mansion in the historic district. Margaret Chen met me in her conference room, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of penetrating gaze that suggested she'd seen every variety of human weakness and criminal stupidity. Let's start with the basics, she said, spreading my financial documents across the polished table. How much did you know about your husband's business dealings? Nothing about the criminal aspects. I knew he handled real estate closings and corporate law, but I didn't pay attention to the specific clients or transactions. Did you ever sign documents you didn't read? Authorize transfers you didn't understand? Co-sign for business loans? Or investment accounts? I thought back through 26 years of marriage, trying to remember every time David had asked me to sign papers while I was distracted with household management or child-rearing. Probably. He handled all our finances. I trusted him completely. That trust might have made you an unwitting accomplice, Chen said bluntly. If your signatures are on documents that facilitated money laundering, the FBI could charge you as a co-conspirator. The possibility hadn't occurred to me. I'd been so focused on protecting myself from David's crimes that I hadn't considered I might already be implicated in them. What kind of charges? Conspiracy to commit money laundering? Aiding and abetting, potentially racketeering if they can prove the law firm was a criminal enterprise. We're talking about decades in federal prison. My hands started shaking. But I didn't know, knowledge has to be proven, and ignorance isn't always a defense. If a reasonable person should have known that legitimate law practice doesn't generate the kind of income you've been living on, that could be enough for a conspiracy charge. I looked around the conference room, taking in the expensive artwork and crystal water glasses, the kind of luxury I'd become accustomed to during David's successful years. Had our lifestyle been funded by criminal activity all along? How many family vacations, designer clothes, and private school tuitions had been paid for with stolen money? There's another problem, Chen continued, pulling out a file I recognized from Fletcher's investigation. Your daughter-in-law's involvement complicates your legal position significantly. How so? If Chloe was blackmailing your husband with knowledge of his criminal activity, and if you can be shown to have knowledge of their affair, prosecutors might argue that you were part of a conspiracy to silence her. The legal web was more complex than I'd imagined. Every relationship in my family was potentially evidence of criminal conspiracy. Every conversation with David or Chloe could be twisted into proof of criminal intent. What do you recommend? Complete cooperation with federal investigators. Voluntary disclosure of everything you know about David's activities, his relationship with Chloe, and any suspicious financial transactions. If we can establish you as a victim rather than a co-conspirator, you might avoid charges entirely. And if I don't cooperate? Then you'll likely be arrested alongside your husband and daughter-in-law, and you'll spend the next several years fighting federal charges with diminished resources and a presumption of guilt. The choice was clear but devastating. To protect myself, I would have to completely betray David and potentially send Chloe to federal prison, destroying Michael's marriage and Emma's family in the process. I need time to think about this. You have until Monday morning. After the arrests, cooperation becomes much more expensive and much less valuable to prosecutors. I left Chen's office with a thick folder of legal documents and a decision that would haunt me regardless of what I chose. Cooperate and destroy my family to save myself, or remain silent and risk losing everything including my freedom. The drive home took me past the park where David was supposedly bonding with Michael and Emma. I found myself pulling into the parking lot, drawn by a desperate need to see my granddaughter before the world collapsed around her. They were easy to spot, David pushing Emma on the swing set while Michael sat on a nearby bench, his posture tense and alert. Even from a distance, I could tell the conversation wasn't going well. I parked behind a cluster of trees and watched through my car window as David gestured animatedly, clearly trying to convince Michael of something. My son's face was skeptical, occasionally shaking his head or interrupting with sharp questions. Then I saw David pull out an envelope and hand it to Michael. Cash. A substantial amount based on the thickness of the stack. Michael stared at the money for a long moment, then tried to hand it back. David refused to take it, saying something that made Michael's face go pale. They were close enough now that I could make out some of their conversation through the car window. Just temporary difficulties, David was saying. Need you to understand that whatever happens, I was trying to provide for the family. Dad, where did this money come from? Michael's voice carried clearly across the playground. Does it matter? Emma's future is secure now. That's what's important. My blood ran cold. David was trying to give Michael stolen money, probably from the client accounts he'd been pilfering. He was attempting to implicate our son in his criminal activity while framing it as paternal generosity. Michael stood up abruptly, still holding the envelope. Dad, you're scaring me. What's going on? Why are you talking like you're going away? Because I might be. And I need you to promise me that you'll take care of your mother and Emma no matter what you hear about me in the coming weeks. What am I going to hear? David was quiet for a long moment, watching Emma climb on the jungle gym with the focused determination of a toddler. That I made some mistakes. That I got involved with people I shouldn't have. That I prioritized the wrong things. What kind of mistakes? The kind that hurt people I love. The kind that can't be undone. Michael sat back down heavily, the envelope of cash balanced on his knees like a loaded weapon. Is this about Chloe? David's head snapped toward Michael. What about Chloe? Dad, I'm not stupid. She's been different lately. Secretive. Spending money we don't have. I found hotel receipts, unexplained charges on her credit cards. Michael's voice cracked. Is my wife having an affair? The moment of truth had arrived, and I found myself holding my breath as David struggled with how much to reveal. He could confess everything and throw himself on Michael's mercy, or he could lie one more time and preserve his son's illusions for a few more days. Yes, David said quietly. Chloe is having an affair. With who? The silence stretched between them like a chasm. David opened his mouth several times without speaking, wrestling with a confession that would destroy any hope of salvaging his relationship with his son. With someone who took advantage of her loneliness. Someone who should have known better. It wasn't a complete lie, but it wasn't the truth either. David was framing himself as Chloe's victim rather than her co-conspirator, painting her as the predator who had seduced him rather than the woman he'd been paying for sex with stolen money. Michael's hands clenched into fists. Who is he, Dad? I want a name. It doesn't matter now. What matters is protecting Emma and helping you move forward. It matters to me. I want to know who destroyed my marriage. David glanced around the playground, probably checking for witnesses to what was about to become either a confession or another layer of deception. His eyes found my car, and for a moment I thought he'd spotted me. But his gaze moved on without recognition. Michael, he said finally, there are things about this situation that you're not ready to hear. Things that would hurt you more than the affair itself. Try me. The man Chloe's been seeing, it's someone you know. Someone you trust. Someone whose betrayal would destroy more than just your marriage. Michael stood up again, pacing in front of the bench where David sat. A friend? Someone from work? One of my groomsmen? Someone closer than that. The realization hit Michael like a physical blow. His face went white, then red, then white again as he processed what David was implying without directly saying. "No," he whispered. "Tell me it's not what I think it is." David's silence was answer enough. "You son of a bitch," Michael said, his voice deadly quiet. "You're sleeping with my wife." Emma chose that moment to call out from the top of the slide, "Daddy. Watch me." Completely oblivious to the family crisis unfolding below her, Michael turned toward his daughter with visible effort, forcing a smile and waving as she slid down. "Great job, princess." When he turned back to David, his face had transformed into something cold and dangerous that I'd never seen before. "How long?" he asked. "Michael, you have to understand, how long?" 6 months. Maybe 8. Since before Emma's birthday party. "Yes." "In our house? In my bed?" "No. Never." We were careful about. Michael's fist connected with David's jaw. Before I could process what was happening, David toppled backward off the bench, blood streaming from his nose as Michael stood over him, shaking with rage. "Daddy!" Emma screamed from the playground equipment, terrified by the violence she was witnessing. Several other parents were running toward them now, cell phones already out to call police or capture video. The family scandal I'd been trying to prevent was about to explode in the most public way possible. Michael scooped up Emma and carried her toward his car, leaving David bleeding on the ground with the envelope of stolen money scattered around him. As he passed my hiding spot, our eyes met through the windshield. The look he gave me was filled with so much pain and betrayal that I knew he'd figured out that I'd known about the affair. In that moment, I lost not just my husband and daughter-in-law, but my son as well. David struggled to his feet, gathering the scattered bills while other parents stared and whispered. When he looked in my direction, there was no surprise in his eyes. He'd known I was watching, had probably orchestrated this confrontation knowing I would witness Michael's reaction. Even his confession was manipulation, designed to make me feel guilty for keeping secrets, for not protecting our son from the truth. David Morrison was still playing games even as his world collapsed around him. As I drove home, my phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "I know you knew. We'll talk after the arrests." After the arrests. He was expecting them, which meant David had told him about the federal investigation too. How much of this conversation had been performance for my benefit, and how much genuine shock and betrayal? I was beginning to understand that everyone in my family had been keeping secrets, playing roles, manipulating each other in ways I was only starting to comprehend. The affair was just the tip of an iceberg of deception that went much deeper than I'd ever imagined. Monday morning was less than 36 hours away, and I still had to decide whether to cooperate with federal investigators or go down with the ship David had deliberately steered into the rocks. Either way, my family, as I'd known it, was already gone. The only question now was how much of myself I was willing to sacrifice to the wreckage. The federal agents arrived at dawn on Monday, just as the first light was touching the Spanish moss in our oak trees. I watched from my bedroom window as 3 black SUVs pulled into our circular driveway, their occupants moving with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this many times before. David was already awake, sitting on the edge of our bed in his pajamas, staring at his hands like he'd never seen them before. We hadn't spoken since the playground confrontation, hadn't even slept in the same room. He'd spent Sunday night in his study, probably destroying evidence or writing letters that would never be sent. "They're here," I said quietly. He nodded without looking up. "I know." The doorbell rang with the kind of authority that couldn't be ignored. I pulled on my robe and walked downstairs, each step feeling like a countdown to the end of everything I'd called home for 26 years. Special Agent Patricia Williams stood on my front porch, flanked by 2 other agents and holding a folder thick with warrants. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with the kind of sharp intelligence that came from years of untangling complex financial crimes. "Mrs. Morrison," she said, showing her badge. "We have warrants for the arrest of David Morrison and the search of these premises." "Where is your husband?" "Upstairs," I replied, stepping aside to let them enter. "He's expecting you." The next few hours unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. David was read his rights and handcuffed in our living room while agents systematically searched every room, photographing documents and seizing computers. They were professional but thorough, treating our home like a crime scene rather than a family residence. Richard Sterling arrived as David was being led to the waiting vehicle. His face was grim but unsurprised, This had been planned, coordinated, probably rehearsed. "Catherine," he said, approaching me as agents continued their search. "Agent Williams wants to speak with you." I found her in David's study, examining the contents of his safe, which had been opened with the kind of precision that suggested they'd had the combination for some time. "Mrs. Morrison," she said, "we'd like you to come to our field office for an interview. You're not under arrest, but we strongly recommend that you bring an attorney." "Margaret Chen is already on her way," I replied. Agent Williams nodded approvingly. "Good choice. She's represented several defendants in cases like this." The word defendants wasn't lost on me. In the FBI's eyes, I wasn't just a witness, I was a potential suspect whose guilt or innocence would be determined by how much I'd known and when I'd known it.by noon. I was sitting in a sterile conference room at the federal building downtown, Margaret Chen beside me as Agent Williams and two other investigators laid out the scope of David's crimes. The evidence was overwhelming: bank records, wire transfers, recorded conversations with Marcus Pellegrino, surveillance photos spanning 18 months. "Your husband stole approximately $4.2 million, Agent Williams said, sliding photographs across the table. "Client settlement funds, real estate escrow accounts, trust funds belonging to minor children. He used shell companies and fake invoices to launder the money through Marcus Pellegrino's construction projects." The number was higher than Richard had told me, higher than Fletcher had estimated. David hadn't just been stealing, he'd been operating a sophisticated criminal enterprise that funneled millions of dollars through Charleston's legal and construction communities. "And Chloe Morrison?" Chen asked. "She's been arrested at her school this morning. We believe she was blackmailing your husband with knowledge of his criminal activity, demanding increasingly large payments to maintain her silence." The image of Chloe being led away in handcuffs from the elementary school where she taught was almost too painful to contemplate. 25 6-year-olds watching their teacher arrested, probably not understanding what they were witnessing but knowing something terrible was happening. "What about Emma?" I asked. "Child Protective Services is evaluating the situation. Your son has requested emergency custody, which will likely be granted given the circumstances." Michael was fighting for Emma, as I'd known he would. But the legal battle would be complicated by the fact that both of Emma's parents were facing federal charges, and her grandfather, who should have been a stabilizing influence, was headed to federal prison. Agent Williams leaned forward. "Mrs. Morrison? We need to know what you knew about your husband's activities and when you knew it." This was the moment Margaret Chen had prepared me for, the question that would determine whether I walked out of this building as a witness or in handcuffs as a defendant. "I knew David was having an affair with our daughter-in-law," I said carefully. "I discovered it 3 weeks ago through a text message on his phone. I hired a private investigator to document the affair for divorce proceedings." "You didn't know about the missing client funds?" "Not until Fletcher, the investigator, told me about the FBI investigation. I thought I was hiring him to prove adultery, not uncover money laundering." Agent Williams consulted her notes. "You signed documents authorizing transfers from several accounts over the past 2 years. Large amounts moving between your personal accounts and your husband's business accounts." My stomach dropped. This was what Chen had warned me about, the possibility that my signatures had been used to facilitate David's crimes without my knowledge. "I signed documents my husband asked me to sign. Tax papers, retirement account transfers, mortgage refinancing. I trusted him to handle our finances." "Did you ever question why your standard of living increased so dramatically over the past 18 months? Expensive vacations, luxury purchases, home renovations that cost more than your husband's legitimate salary could support?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. I thought about the kitchen renovation that had cost $80,000, the European vacation that had seemed like David's attempt to rekindle our marriage, the jewelry and clothes that I'd accepted as evidence of his success and love. "I thought the law firm was doing well," I said finally. "David told me they'd won several large settlements, that his partnership percentage had increased." "Those settlements were real," Agent Williams acknowledged. "But the money that paid for your lifestyle came from client accounts, not legal fees." The realization was sickening. Our marriage hadn't just been destroyed by infidelity, it had been funded by theft. Every expensive dinner, every luxury purchase, every symbol of our supposed happiness had been bought with stolen money. Mrs. Morrison, Agent Williams continued, we believe your husband used your joint accounts to launder stolen funds. However, given your cooperation and apparent lack of knowledge about the criminal enterprise, we're prepared to offer you immunity in exchange for your continued assistance. What kind of assistance? Chen asked. Testimony against your husband and daughter-in-law. Financial records from your personal accounts. Access to communications and documents that might be protected by spousal privilege if you don't waive it voluntarily. The offer was generous but devastating. Complete immunity from prosecution, but only if I agreed to testify against the two people whose actions had already destroyed my family. I need time to consider this, Chen said. You have 24 hours, Agent Williams replied. After that, the offer expires and Mrs. Morrison becomes a subject of the investigation rather than a cooperating witness. The drive home took me past Michael and Chloe's neighborhood, where news vans were already circling like vultures. The arrest of an elementary school teacher for money laundering had made the evening news, and reporters were trying to piece together the story of Charleston's latest scandal. My phone had been ringing constantly, friends, neighbors, journalists who'd somehow gotten my number. I'd turned it off hours ago, unable to face the questions and false sympathy that would define my social interactions for the foreseeable future. The house felt enormous and empty when I returned. Federal agents had left it in reasonable condition, but their presence lingered in moved furniture and missing computers. This had been my home for 15 years, the place where I'd raised my children and built my marriage. Now it felt like a crime scene. I called Margaret Chen at 8 o'clock. I'll take the immunity deal, I told her. Are you sure? Testifying against your husband will make reconciliation impossible. There's nothing left to reconcile. David made his choices, and now I have to make mine. And your daughter-in-law? I thought about Chloe sitting in a federal holding cell, probably terrified and alone. She'd made her own choices too, trading her integrity for expensive clothes and the thrill of forbidden romance. But she was also Emma's mother, and her conviction would leave my granddaughter without either parent. I'll testify truthfully about what I know, I said. If that helps or hurts her case, so be it. The next 18 months passed in a blur of legal proceedings, media attention, and family reconstruction. David pleaded guilty to money laundering and conspiracy charges, receiving 12 years in federal prison. His cooperation with prosecutors helped dismantle Marcus Pellegrino's entire operation, but it couldn't undo the damage to our family. Chloe fought the charges initially, claiming she'd been manipulated by David and had no knowledge of where the money came from. But when prosecutors presented evidence of her blackmail payments and explicit threats to expose David unless he increased her compensation, she accepted a plea deal for 4 years in federal prison. Michael was awarded full custody of Emma, though Chloe would be eligible for supervised visitation after serving her sentence. He moved across the country to Portland, taking a job with a technology company that had no connection to Charleston's legal community. He spoke to me once every few months, polite but distant conversations focused entirely on Emma's development and needs. The house was sold to pay restitution to David's victims. After legal fees and taxes, I was left with enough money to rent a small apartment and start over at 51 years old. I went back to school to update my legal credentials, eventually finding work with a nonprofit organization that helped white-collar crime victims navigate the financial aftermath of fraud. Richard Sterling rebuilt his practice as a solo attorney, specializing in ethics compliance and legal malpractice prevention. We occasionally crossed paths at legal conferences, exchanging polite nods but never speaking. He'd saved himself by sacrificing his best friend, and while I understood his choice, I couldn't bring myself to forgive it. The most difficult part was watching Emma grow up through video calls and occasional visits. She was too young to understand why Grandpa David had disappeared or why Mommy lived somewhere she couldn't visit. Michael did his best to explain in age-appropriate terms, but I could see the confusion and sadness in her eyes. On Emma's 4th birthday, I flew to Portland for a weekend visit. She was taller now, with Chloe's green eyes and Michael's stubborn chin, a perfect blend of her flawed parents. We spent Saturday at the zoo, Sunday at a children's museum, creating new memories to layer over the traumatic ones. Grandma Catherine, she said as I tucked her into bed Sunday night, why don't you live with us like Grandma Susan does? Michael's mother-in-law had moved to Portland to help with childcare, becoming the stable grandmother figure that Emma needed. I was the visiting grandmother, the one associated with sadness and complicated explanations. Because sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, I told her, and those mistakes change where they can live and who they can be with. Did you make a mistake? The question hit me harder than any prosecutor's interrogation. Had I made a mistake? Should I have confronted David immediately instead of hiring Fletcher? Should I have warned Michael about his father's crimes? Should I have tried to protect Chloe despite her betrayal? Yes, sweetheart. I made mistakes too. But you're still my grandma? Always. No matter what mistakes any of us make, I will always be your grandma. Flying home to Charleston, I reflected on the woman I'd become versus the one I'd been 3 years earlier. The naive wife who'd trusted blindly was gone, replaced by someone harder but more self-reliant. I'd lost my marriage, my financial security, and my relationship with my son, but I'd gained something too, a clarity about who I was when everything else was stripped away. I still drove past the Bellman Charleston place sometimes, remembering the Thursday nights when I'd innocently attended book club while my husband and daughter-in-law destroyed our family one stolen dollar at a time. The jasmine still bloomed outside my old kitchen window, though someone else noticed its fragrance now. David wrote to me occasionally from federal prison, letters that mixed apology with justification, remorse with blame. I read them but never responded. There was nothing left to say to the man who'd stolen my granddaughter's future to fund his midlife crisis. Chloe's letters were different, raw with genuine remorse and desperate love for the daughter she couldn't hold. I answered those, providing updates about Emma's development and sending photographs that Michael approved. Whatever else Chloe had done, she was still Emma's mother, and that relationship deserved preservation if possible. On the 3rd anniversary of the arrests, I received an unexpected visitor. Michael stood on my apartment doorstep, holding Emma's hand and looking older than his 32 years. "Mom," he said simply. "We need to talk." We spent the afternoon in Hampton Park, watching Emma play on the same playground equipment where David had confessed his crimes 3 years earlier. Michael was quieter now, shaped by betrayal into someone more cautious but also more empathetic. "I'm sorry," he said as Emma chased ducks around the pond. "For cutting you out, for blaming you. For Dad's choices, for punishing you because I needed someone to be angry with. You had every right to be angry. Maybe. But not at you. You were a victim too, just like me." We talked for hours, rebuilding a relationship that had been shattered by circumstances neither of us had controlled. He told me about his therapy, his struggles with trust, his determination to give Emma the stability that our family had lacked. I told him about my work with fraud victims, my small apartment, my gradual acceptance of a life I'd never planned but was learning to embrace. "Do you ever regret testifying against Dad?" he asked. "No. He made his choices, and I made mine. The only thing I regret is not protecting you and Emma better from the fallout. You couldn't have protected us from something you didn't know was coming." As the sun set over Charleston Harbor, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I realized that this conversation was the closure I'd been seeking for 3 years. Not with David, who remained unrepentant despite his imprisonment, or with Chloe, who was serving the consequences of her choices. But with Michael, whose forgiveness mattered more than anyone else's. Emma fell asleep in my lap as we sat on the park bench, her small body warm against mine. This was what I'd been fighting to preserve, not a marriage built on lies or a family held together by secrets, but this simple moment of love between a grandmother and her granddaughter. "She asks about you," Michael said quietly. "Wants to know when Grandma Catherine is coming to visit again. Whenever you'll have me. How about Christmas? We could use some help decorating the tree." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Christmas. In Portland, building new traditions for a reconstructed family. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was honest in a way my previous life had never been. The weight of silence that had nearly destroyed us was finally lifting, replaced by truth. That was painful but healing. Some families are born, some are chosen, and some are rebuilt from the wreckage of betrayal. As Emma stirred in my arms and smiled sleepily up at me, I understood that reconstruction was possible. Not recovery, too much had been lost for that, but something new and authentic could grow from the ashes of deception. The jasmine would bloom again next spring, but it would no longer remind me of betrayal. It would remind me of resilience, of the possibility of starting over, of the love that survives even when everything else crumbles. I was no longer David Morrison's wife or the victim of his crimes. I was Catherine Morrison, grandmother to Emma, survivor of my own story, and finally, truthfully, myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.